Welcome, everyone. I am so delighted to have you here and just want to wish you a hearty congratulations on your Oscar nominations. They are really, really well-deserved, and such an eclectic and cool group of movies. Really looking forward to talking to you about them. I wanted to start, Stanley, with you. I know that you had been circling the idea of making a movie about Attica for years, and I was curious why it came together when it did.
I think it came together because I realized that it was now or never. You know, it was maybe 48 years after the rebellion at Attica that happened in '71, and the people were getting old. And you know, if I didn't get them real soon, they would start disappearing, and their memories would start fading. And so that's really what kind of pushed me to make the film when we did. We didn't really even realize that we were hitting right up on the 50th anniversary and that the film would be made, that we would coincide with the 50th anniversary, but we really just wanted to get the film made.
I mean, Quest, that probably resonates a bit for you. You also had people who were not going to be around much longer who you wanted to talk to.
Yeah, you know, there's a very specific psychograph that I was looking for. I knew that 50 years after the fact, any quote unquote adults in the room, chances are, you know, either their memory would be spotty or they wouldn't have been here. So the most I could hope for is to find someone who was at least between the ages of 10 and 20 during 1969, who would now be, you know, sort of like kissing 70-ish. It's kind of weird that the emotional centerpiece of my film comes from someone who was 5 years old. And this was like my very first interview. So I was very, very dismissive when he walked in. Like I looked at him and I was like, he looks 1 second older than me, like in his mom's stomach or something. And but what I didn't realize at the time that, you know, I was just in the mind state that I was just putting together a really cool music documentary. And I didn't realize the emotional component until he revealed, like, this is his first memory in life. And so once he just started tearing up, and, you know, because this is something that no one believed that he ever saw. So I realized early that this is giving people their actual life back, you know, in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Rintu, and I think about access. What struck me about your movie was the places that you got your cameras. Some of them police stations, hard to access remote locations, a mine. And I was struck by not only the fact that the journalists, the women you're covering got there, but that you and your team got there. Can you talk a little bit of the logistics of getting your cameras around these various locations?
We spent a lot of time in these regions. The film took 4 years to come into being. And I think it was very evident that we didn't belong to the region. And so our idea was to make our presence as, we were a very lean crew. It was just literally the three of us, me, a co-director, my co-director, Sushmit, who's also the co-cinematographer, and then another cinematographer. I was doubling up and also doing original sound. So, you know, we knew that we had to be a very tight team so that we don't stick out. And at the same time, I think we realized that the journalists themselves had a lot of trust. They'd been working in the region as print journalists for 14 years at that time. And most of the places that they worked were in media dark villages where no one would show up, and they would. And so people inherently had the sense of, here's someone I can trust. And I think that was extended to us in police stations, in offices of politicians. We sort of like went into this with this attitude that we're here to make a film on the journalist, and would you be all right if we do it? And I think part of it is also them being consistently believing that what can these women journalists do? Why would anyone want to make a film on them? I think them being dismissive, them being not truly understanding that these women journalists had any power kind of helped us, because they were like, what would this mean in any which way? And so it was a combination of many things and a bit of a borrowed swag from the ladies themselves. If they went in, we went in. Unless they said, it's good that you don't come along, we wouldn't. So every time it was different, but generally just keeping the vibe really cool and easy. And if someone's saying, oh, don't do it, and then just don't do it. And it's the comfort that we wanted. It's the authenticity of the conversation between the journalist and the police officer, for instance, that we were interested in. And that's how we rolled out the 4 years.
It's amazing how you can sometimes use being underestimated to your advantage, which it seems like you did. Jessica, you also had these incredible locations, these industrial locations, and you shot them in such an interesting way. They were kind of mesmerizing. I'm curious, once you got your access, how did you decide how you were going to shoot in these spaces? What were some, what were your approaches?
That's a good question. We never knew what the spaces were going to look like until we actually showed up, since we weren't able to go and scout locations beforehand. It was sort of just showing up and seeing what we could get and what was going on. And oftentimes the locations and the people and the processes that I was trying to capture was completely different than what I expected it to be. But I think that was part of the joy of making this film. And since I wasn't going in with any thesis or central kind of statement that I was trying to prove, I was able to be very malleable and kind of pivot to what was being presented in front of me. But in terms of how some of the approaches, because we are shooting in a lot of industrial spaces that can seem the processes can seem brutal and repetitive. These are factories, and where there's a lot of kind of dehumanizing labor happening. I wanted to be able to balance that with having as much sort of first person sensory feelings as we could. So as often as I could get permission from individuals, we would try to lav people so that we could get kind of first person audio, even if people weren't having dialogue with one another. It was important just to get kind of unexpected things that that I would never plan for. So one thing that is sticking out is there's one of my favorite scenes is this young woman at a plastic water bottle factory where she's placing labels onto plastic water bottles. And we mic'd her even though, she wasn't standing with anyone, she wasn't talking to anyone. But there's this moment where she kind of pauses to take a sip of a thermos of water that she brings to work for herself, which I found, supremely ironic. Of course, somebody who's working at a plastic water bottle factory bringing their own thermos, and she unscrews the lid to take a sip and then screws it back on. And there's this metal sound of her unscrewing the lid that later on, when reviewing the footage, I heard and loved it. And it's not something that I would ever be able to think to fully in later. It was just because we happened to have that first person audio that I think that really gave us this sort of intimacy into her world as she's working and taking a break.
Yeah, I remember that detail. That's actually something, these movies are all so different, but one thing I think they might have in common is these portraits of people who are kind of finding dignity in spaces when people are trying to take it from them. It struck me actually in each one of these, and that little detail of this factory worker, like taking her own sort of a break. It wasn't that different to me from the men in Attica, finding their way to stand up in that system. It was interesting. When you think about form and the tools you use to tell your stories, Jonas, obviously once you decided that animation was how you were going to do this, how did you choose the style? How did you choose the people who were going to do the animation?
It really comes from the testimony that was given to me by Ahmir. It was really about listening really carefully to his voice and finding a way to support that in a way that felt authentic, because it is animation, and it was crucial to me to underline that underneath the animation we have a real person. So we just tried to be as precise as possible to kind of depict Afghanistan in the 80s as it looked like. So we would do a lot of research, finding photos, finding archival footage from that time of period where he lived in Afghanistan in the 80s, and take elements directly from the archival footage and put it into the animation, you know, redraw it and put it in there. So it felt like it belonged to the same world as the archival footage that's also in the film. And then we found this animation studio called Sun Creature Studios. This is my first animated film, so I had no idea how to do this. So they really took me by the hand and helped out creating this style of animation. And you know, Amin's story is really a story about, of course, the flight from Afghanistan to Denmark, but it's also a story of solitude, of feeling lonely, of keeping secrets, and feeling that you have to keep people at a distance because you can't be honest to who you are. And we wanted to feel this in the style of animation. So we really, you know, looked everywhere kind of for inspirations that could support this. And one was, you know, Edward Hopper. We used his paintings as reference for how we would treat light and color in the film. And there's also this sense of solitude in his paintings. But also a photographer called Ray K. Metzger. A lot of live action films. But it was really, you know, visual artists who helped us to find the style of animation. And then at times in this testimony, when Amin would start to talk about his traumas, things that's really difficult to talk about, you can sense in his voice that he would slow down, he would lose words, and he would kind of, sometimes he would even stop. And here I thought, okay, but we need to see this change in the testimony, in the visual style as well. So we created this more kind of expressive and surreal style of animation to represent these really difficult memories he had, his traumas, because that somewhat felt more honest, because all of a sudden it wasn't about what things looked like or what happened, but it was about an emotion he had inside. So we tried to be more kind of surreal and expressive in the animation.
When you're relying in a significant way on archival footage, Stanley, as you do, how do you find the structure of the story? You know what you have, but how do you decide the order it's going to unfold, the outline of the piece?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that worked to our advantage is that we had an outline from the beginning, so that, you know, we made a few assumptions. That one, that we didn't want to use narration, and then we actually thought that we would interview historians, and we interviewed one historian, and he just seemed to be coming from another world. I mean, he was great. He was really great, but he just didn't fit. And so then we decided that we would make the film without historians either. But we knew that we decided really early that we wanted kind of a day-to-day structure, you know, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, just a simple structure so that you can orient yourself as a viewer, and that every day was different enough so that it was kind of like a roller coaster ride. So we had that structure, and we knew that in the middle, we wanted, you know, Billy Quinn dies, the guard dies, and then everything changes, because now the prisoners that have taken over Attica are going to be charged, or they feel like they're going to be charged with murder. And so that, again, changes the whole concept of what they wanted and what the film is. So we knew those things, and that really helped us. It was like a framework that then we can hang the rest of the film on.
Mm-hmm. Did everyone here know what your structure was going to be when you started, or did anybody have a different process to finding it? Everybody else is saying they didn't know. Quest, what changed about?
I was going to say, you know, the one thing I really didn't talk about on the press run was, you know, March 16th of 2020 was a crucial shooting day for my storyline. And which essentially, you know, March 16th is the day that we all consider the world stopping. Mm-hmm. So we had to wash everything away. And, you know, I was borderline leaning on, well, do we just wait for the 55th anniversary, or do we, you know, is the world about to come to an end? But no, like, we pushed through and pretty much had to, I won't say start over from scratch, but the end result that we have now, was definitely not my initial intent. And weird to say that I'm glad that everything happened the way it did. What I wound up doing though, as with every project I do with music and my books and all that stuff, I actually, I don't know if it's because I'm left-handed. I actually work backwards. I start at the end and work my way to the beginning. But initially, I will say that as far as my interviewees were concerned and my talking heads, all of that went out the window. So I had to regroup for maybe like 3 weeks, and we had to come up with an entirely different plan. Learn what Zoom was, learn how to send people out into the fields, and learn how to operate machinery so that cameras can come in someone's living room without them, being in person. So yeah, there's a whole, I think for a lot of storytellers in the last year and a half, just adjusting to non-traditional ways of putting stories together was the common denominator for all of us.
Who else here had your movie impacted by the pandemic in terms of the way you shot it, or the way? Stanley, how was yours impacted? What changed?
Well, we were slated to start filming in April. Like April 1st was going to be our first shoot day. And then the pandemic hit and everything stopped and shut down. And so we had to shut down. But it allowed us to do more research. And then, our film is very archival based, and the archival houses just closed. So, NBC, ABC, CBS, their archival departments, if you got to get rid of somebody, you got to run the network, you still got to put on the TV shows. So the archives just closed. They were like, okay, we're closed. We don't know when we're coming back. Don't even talk to us. Bye. And we just had to keep talking and just keep calling. And luckily, our archival producer is like a dog, and she just kept on, pushing.
Yo, I thought I was the only one.
but I mean, and look, COVID is horrible, and people died. So I'm not gonna complain, that much. But there's not anything good I can say about COVID in the filmmaking process. It just was like, when you watch the Olympic diving and they say, okay, now we're gonna dive off this high diving board, we're gonna do a triple somersault and a backflip and stuff like that. That's what it was like, and just a constant adjustment. But also, as Questlove said, the people that we were also interviewing were older, so we had to keep them safe, and then that was really important for us.
Jessica, I noticed in your film, a lot of the factory workers are masked. Was that because of the pandemic, or was that how they normally worked, or how did the timing of your production intersect with the timing of the pandemic?
So my timing, I was fortunate with it, where our last shoot was December 2019, right before the pandemic hit. And I was considering going back to China one final time for another shoot, but that kind of helped make the decision that I had enough footage. Some of the factory workers you see are wearing masks. I think in general in Asia, people are more used to wearing masks for various reasons, like this sort of awareness of, bodily kind of the viruses in general being able to be spread. If you're sick, it's more, customary to wear a mask, but also for pollution. And finally, specifically in these factories that you see, a lot of people are wearing them because of the toxic fumes that are in the factories. Like in the textile factory, I remember I had to wear a mask because of the melting of the resin coming off of the bodies. And not everyone would wear a mask too, which was kind of striking to me. But in terms of the timeline, yeah, December 2019 was my last shoot, came back, and then I just edited from home for a year or so. And the thing that I also got fortunate about is that my composer, Dan Deacon, was supposed to be on tour then. And he unfortunately wasn't able to go on tour because he's also a musician. So, he had this big tour set up. And then when he wasn't able to, he was able to put more time to working on the film with me. He came on pretty early in the process, and like after the first shoot, we were kind of sending material back and forth to each other. But then after the lockdown, we were really forced to just kind of sit with the material and had that blessing of time and not outside distractions. So we had these kind of weekly Zoom calls for months and months, maybe a year or so, where we were able to really kind of shift the score as the edit was evolving as well.
The score is such an important part of your movie. It's so interesting to know that it really affects the kind of tension that I felt when I was watching those factory settings. Well, let's talk about music. I mean, what was the hardest part about getting the music you wanted for your film? Jonas, I know you have some very specific musical choices in yours. What was hard?
You know, the most of the music and the film, there's both the score, of course, and then there's these pop cultural references in the film. And most of them come from, you know, Ahmir's own soundtrack. One of the first interviews I did with him, he talked about this pink Walkman he had that his sister had given him. And I asked him what he listened to. And to my surprise, you know, he listened to a lot of the same kind of Scandinavian pop music I listened to in my youth. So we put that in there, you know, AHA and Roxette and Ace of Base. But the most difficult thing was in the process of doing these interviews, I had a feeling I really wanted to use this Daft Punk song in the end. There's this club scene at the end, and it just felt like it fitted perfectly because, again, there's this sense of melancholy and solitude, but also a party vibe to the song. But the difficult thing about Daft Punk is they own their own rights to the music, so you need to get a hold of Daft Punk. And you know, us this kind of independent filmmaker in Denmark. I think I spanned them for 3 years in a row to try to get a hold of them. And in the end, you know, my producer said, "Dude, you need to find something else." And she said, "Put up like a deadline." And then I just kind of intensified my spamming. And to my luck, 2 weeks prior to this deadline, they got back and they saw the clip and they really liked it. And they were very generous in kind of giving the rights to it for a very cheap price. But it was terrifying because I couldn't see any other song for that sequence of the film. And it was, I think, one of the biggest reliefs of the production for me that we could use it.
Quest, what was the music rights experience like on your film? I don't know enough about rights to know, did they all come with the footage or did you have to individually negotiate? Oh, that file says no. No, they did not.
Well, the thing is that because the original producer, Hal Tolshin and Tony Lawrence, had sort of come out the gate saying, you know, this is for a television show back in 1969. Apparently, all those contracts were still binding some 50 years later. However, music was, well, you know, it's a good problem to have, but my first draft was like 3 hours and 25 minutes, of which, of course, Searchlight was like, you got to cut 2 hours, which is hard to do because, you know, this is a concert footage. And I will say that, you know, whereas we listen to songs and they're like, you know, 3 hours and 3 minutes and 30 seconds or 4 minutes. The live concert version of that is sort of like 6 minutes, 7 minutes, you know, because they're communicating with the audience. So there was a lot of cuts I had to do. Initially, you know, I wanted to include the hits and the exciting moments. And when you're whittling down to 2 hours, I decided to go with my heart and go with the exciting moments, which in the case of Stevie Wonder, it's like, okay, we're not going to do My Sharia Moore or like his big hits of the day, or like the Fifth Dimension doing My Beautiful Balloon, or like the big giant hits of the day. But for me, it was more important to show the paradigm shift, because 69 was such a, what 2020 will be for us when it's 2040, you know, we'll look back at 2020 the same way that we are looking back at 1969 as a crucial year. So for me, it was more important to include the music that gave me goosebumps, that showed me what the future is going to look like, as opposed to just the hits. So I had to cut a lot of songs.
So is there like a Quest's cut version of this movie that they'll put on Hulu or something where
You know, it's
people will
weird.
get the hits?
I went to IMAX to see the rooftop only version of Get Back.
Hmm.
So we're talking. That's all.
Okay. All right. Stay tuned, everybody.
We're talking. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I know a couple of you have production companies, and you think of this obviously not just as an artist and a filmmaker, but this is also a business. This is also how you make your living. It used to be considered that documentary filmmaking was a very hard way to make a living. I'm curious, Stanley, is that changing as there are seemingly more outlets? Has it gotten any easier than it once was? What do you think?
I think for some it's gotten easier. For me, it's gotten easier, because I've been around a while. But it's much more of a business. We run a doc lab, where we work with, first-time filmmakers. And a lot of times they make a great film, but they have a hard time getting their second film. So I think that, and so for a certain, small group of people, I think it's gotten a lot easier, in a way, to raise money for films. But for most people, I think, and for people we work with, we're doing their first and second films, for people of color, a little bit has changed. It hasn't gotten worse, but it's not like, there's money laying in the street that you can walk like a video game and pick up and a bell rings or something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Rintu, what's it like for you?
It's hard. Especially when it's a production company based out of the US, out of Europe. I think to just understand how the whole infrastructure works, we have none back home, so we have to learn everything. Some of these systems are still growing, and to be able to, I think, communicate the vision that we had for this film consistently, have the production or the producing team to be Indian. That was very important for us, that the principal crew is from the region. And so those negotiations were hard. Sometimes it's, money is available, but then once you say yes to take it, what are you going to compromise? And I think we had a lot more to prove consistently, and the fact that the film has reached so far, being outside of these systems gives a sense of confidence in other filmmakers who are also producers and maybe outside the region to say, oh, okay, independent documentary filmmaking can be robust, and we can get into those doors and keep it open for others. So I think it's a mixed bag. It was super hard in the beginning, but the fact that we've been able to slightly nudge and push has worked out beautifully for us.
It's interesting because the Motion Picture Academy has gotten a lot more international over the last few years, and the documentary branch in particular. And I think potentially some of these nominations reflect that. It's just a much broader group of people thinking about these movies than once were. Last question. It's interesting. Any one of these topics could have been a news story or a Wikipedia entry. What is it that the form of documentary brings that enables you to tell these stories in a different way?
I think it's really about the identification, that you're able to relate to stories because it becomes personal, and you open a window to a world that you don't know, and you're able to, relate to people you wouldn't normally identify with. I think that's really the power of documentary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the documentary put together so many different things, so they put together first person stories, they put together, pictures, they put together music, certainly in Attica, people are telling very, very emotional stories that, you can't, there's no other medium that can do that. So it's a combination of so many art forms, I think, and when it works, I think it really works.
I'll say that for me, in the very beginning, I got this project in like late 2017, early 2018. So I knew that I had a certain key audience that would be all in, which of course is, baby boomers and maybe Generation X. I was slightly concerned that what I was talking about wouldn't hit latter half millennials or Gen Z. And then a funny thing happened, in 2020, which is basically the footage we were editing was mirroring exactly what was happening on the news at that moment. And so suddenly, Gen Z was living in the time period that and the same exact actions were happening. So it's weird how 3 years ago, I don't think this movie would have resonated as much as it does right now, simply because time has come full circle.
Mhm. Mhm. Rintu, did you want to say something? You were
Yeah,
leaning
I think,
forward. Yeah.
what I find interesting in this room of films and filmmakers is each of these films is about lives that would typically be made invisible. And the fact that each one of us has decided to look in that direction and spotlight that story. I think for me, it's storytelling is really about that, about finding a reality that's not necessarily my own, but finding a part of me there. And then the circle just keeps expanding. And then my story, their story becomes our story. And that's what I find absolutely exciting, dynamic about nonfiction filmmaking.
Beautifully said.
And for me, I see documentary not as separate from any other art form, whether it's a cinematic art form or visual arts or novels even. So I feel like my job as a documentary filmmaker is to identify these kind of quietly poetic moments that are happening in reality and kind of elevate them into the art form rather than just kind of letting them go unnoticed. So a lot of it is, yeah, to echo people, just putting this spotlight on sort of these poetic, more quiet moments that might go unnoticed.
Well, I thank you all so much for this conversation, and congratulations again on your nominations. Such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.